Hello there, and welcome to Module 2 of Psychology as a Science and a Profession. I'm so glad you're joining me again today. So we're going to start with talking about the research process as well as variables and levels of measurement today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And if you would like, on Blackboard, you can go ahead and pull down your Module 2 PowerPoints. And you will see that right here for you, it says research process, variables, and levels of measurement. So let's start out first by talking about the research process includes several different components, but let's start out with talking about the initial observation. When we go out and about each day, whether it's to go shopping or to just take a walk or just anything we're doing, maybe we're walking around our house, maybe we're walking around the workplace, maybe we're just walking outside. Oftentimes what happens is we just observe something. We see something happening. We might see an interaction between two people. We might see an interaction between an entire family or group of friends, maybe even strangers. Sometimes we might see things like children playing in a playground, or maybe older adults sitting near an assisted living facility, talking with family and maybe with each other. The initial observation is just something that we see. It's something out there that we notice. But it's not just any everyday thing that we happen to just notice for a quick second and then let go. It's often an observation where we say, oh, wait, that's interesting. I haven't seen that before. You know what? I have seen that before, but I'd like to learn more about it. So it's something we see, but we decide needs more explaining. Because oftentimes our one observation or our two observations is not enough for us to get, or even 3 or 4, is not enough for us to be able to make judgments about, or to be able to say we can actually study it as a research question. And the reason for that is because we need to be able to show that there is actually something objectively happening, not just that we're subjectively noticing it. Subjective would mean that I believe I'm seeing something. Objective would mean some way we can actually measure it to show it's happening. So let's say, for example, since I brought up a playground and children, let's say, for example, I'm walking by a playground and I happen to notice that there's not much playground equipment at this, and the kids seem to be playing well together. And I'm thinking, you know, that really stands out. There's something about these children in this playground. They seem to really be getting along well. What is it about these children? And so I'm just sort of observing, and I decide, you know what, I'm going to go to a couple other playgrounds around town and see what's going on. Kids, they're playing pretty well together, but they're fighting and, you know, being kids, something different. And then I start to notice that, well, incidents, but there just happens to be more playground equipment in the part of the playground where there's more arguing going on. And there's less playground equipment in the playgrounds where in the playgrounds where there's less arguing going on. Where there's more arguing going on, there's more equipment. So I might say to myself, well, is it possible that when there's more to argue over, that the kids are arguing more? And is it possible that when there's less to argue over, they're actually learning to share because they have to in order to be able to enjoy the playground at all that day? Or they might just have to sit around some days and not get to play at all unless they learn how to share? So I might start to ask that question. Well, the next thing I'm going to do at that point is actually see if something like that's happening. So I'm going to go out, and we're going to talk about this some more again, but I'm going to go out and I'm going to sit down the next day at one playground with a lot of playground equipment, another playground without much playground equipment, and I'm going to observe the children. And I'm going to observe the frequency, possibly, of the arguments they're having. And a little bit later today, we'll talk about how do we define that, the arguments. But maybe I want to look at the frequency of the arguments and how many arguments are occurring. It doesn't have to do with proportion. It doesn't have to do with probability. All it has to do with is the idea of the number of arguments that's happening. And then I might say, okay, I'm going to go and look at the frequency of arguments in a given period of time, maybe the same period of time, as I did at the playground where there wasn't that much equipment. And now I'm going to go to a place where there is a lot of equipment and track the number of arguments that are happening between the kids. So I get that information. I come back home, I look at it, and I start to notice, you know what, this is really interesting. It seems as though there are actually more arguments happening at the playground where there's more equipment than at the playground where there's not. And it seems like it's actually quite a bit more arguments. But you know what, I'm gonna go and look for this one more day. So I'm gonna go on another day. I'm gonna look for maybe a different duration of time. Instead of maybe looking at it for 30 minutes, maybe I'll watch it for an hour. And then I'm going to look at the frequency of arguments within that hour period of time at both playgrounds. Or maybe this time I'll switch it up. Maybe I'll go to a different playground that doesn't have much equipment and another playground that still has a lot of equipment. And we could define that by less than 5 pieces of equipment and maybe greater than 10 pieces of equipment. And so I come back and I'm still finding the same thing. And I say, this is really fascinating. How is this really possible that no one's figured this out? Let me see if there's any kind of theory out there that's talking about this. So that's the next step in our research process. We've seen our initial observation, and we're starting to actually look to see whether or not the observation that we subjectively made is actually objectively happening. So we say, okay, let me see if there's any theory out there that actually explains any of this. So theory is just a larger phenomenon that explains the overarching idea of many different research questions under it. So I'm going to look up, you know, maybe I'll type in to a search. We'll learn about that as well, how to find articles, but maybe I want to type into a library search something along the lines of equipment and amount of equipment and number of arguments. Nope, I don't really get much that I'm interested in. Probably a whole lot of broad stuff that goes off, because equipment, that could really be anything, right? Looking at playground equipment and children and arguments. Nope, not finding anything. How else can I think of playground equipment? Maybe toys. And okay, so maybe I'm going to look up quantity of toys and number of arguments with kids. Oh, and then maybe I come upon something. I come upon this theory that possibly talks about that children having too many toys actually makes them unhappier. And maybe children not having enough toys actually makes them happier. But what is that? What is it about the happier? How are they defining happy? So I start to look at that more, and I see that in general, they feel as though that some of the research questions are actually talking about how they feel as though they had to learn to share at a younger age, maybe with siblings or maybe with friends. And maybe not all the articles are talking about that under that theory, but maybe some of those research questions are. And so some of that theory is actually, some research questions are being explained by a similar theory. It's not exactly what I was looking at, though. So I start to search, is there anything else related to anything related to this theory that's been out there? And I search, nope, can't find anything about playground equipment and children arguing. Okay, so what am I going to do next? I'm going to say, I can actually do something with this. I can come up with a research question about amount of playground equipment and whether or not maybe I want to do an experiment, or I'm going to look at whether or not it causes children to argue more. But maybe I just want to start with something correlational. And we're going to talk about what that means, but maybe I just want to look at, you know, in its naturally occurring environment, is it possible that after looking at several different playgrounds, situations where there's a little bit of equipment and a lot of equipment with all these different children, now what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and observe over several different playgrounds whether or not there's actually differences over time, over several playgrounds with different groups of children. If there's actually a difference in the frequencies, maybe even within a given duration of time. And so I want to ask a question like that. And so let's say we're just doing it in the naturally occurring environment. I might ask a question like, do arguments between children at playgrounds increase as number of playground equipment options increase? And that way I'm looking at, is there a correlation between arguments between children at playgrounds and number of equipment options? Usually when people ask a correlation question, they're just asking it in general. Is there a correlation between the two? Why? Because that leaves open for us to be able to talk about later that there could have been a correlation, but it might have been in the other direction. One might have gone up and the other one might have gone down. So it's just a vaguer way of saying it. By me saying, and we're going to talk about correlations in here, by me saying as one amount increases, the amount of arguments increases, the amount of equipment increases, that's a type of correlation that we're going to eventually call positive correlation. As one increases, the other one increases. Whereas if one increase and the other one decrease, we're going to talk about that as a negative correlation. So you don't need to know that yet at this module. So that's my research question. But then I need to know what is it that I'm measuring here? I need to know what I'm measuring. So in order to know what I'm measuring, I need to know what my variables are. I need to know that my one variable is going to be, so my two variables are the things I'm looking at, wanting to see which directions they're going in. So one of those variables, and if we were live right now, I'd ask you which one, but one of those variables was the number of arguments between the children. And the other variable is the number of playground equipment options. Okay? And so so basically the question is how am I going to measure these two different variables? Now, because we're not actually saying that one causes the other or one predicts the other, we're only saying that we're noticing in their environment, if one goes up, the other goes up, if one goes down, the other goes down. Really, we're just talking about these as two separate variables. Either of them could be the one predicting, either of them could be the one that's the outcome. But right now, it's just our two correlational variables. And they can be flipped. You can decide that one would be the predictor and one would be the outcome, but you can also flip it because, again, we don't know which one's predicting which or which one would be causing which if we actually had the causation effect, which definitely we don't have in a situation where we're just watching something in its naturally occurring environment, which we will get to at another point. So what we do is we decide how are we going to measure these two variables. So our first variable, the number of arguments between children, we're going to measure that in frequency within a 1 hour period of time. And we're going to do the other thing. We're going to measure the other variable, the number of playground equipment at a particular playground. But we just need to count once the number of pieces of playground equipment at that playground at that time. Okay. And our research design then is such that we are doing an observational design where we are going to sit down in different playgrounds and collect this data.